Okay, today we're talking about emotional functioning, and I'm really passionate about it. I think it makes sense to a lot of people. It's also hardly ever incorporated in any curricula in school, so people usually find this interesting. Now, we've got a couple of videos already on the Zephyr Wellness YouTube channel that talk about this, but this one's going to be a little more in depth, and we're going to do a series, one on basically every emotion that we have, and you can see we have 10 core emotions. These are brought to us by a guy named Carroll Izard, Carroll-Izard is his last name. It's like a lizard, but without the L. Now, what Dr. Izard studied for like 50 years is emotional functioning. In fact, he literally wrote the book on the psychology of emotions, and it's called The Psychology of Emotions. I recommend checking that book out. However, it's about 200 bucks on Amazon these days, even though it was written in like 1991. So I'm going to do you the favor of distilling down that information into this presentation and the subsequent shorter videos. This one's going to be a bit longer because it lays the foundation, but I think you're going to find it interesting. So first and foremost, you may have heard around the interwebs or across social media or just in your own life that there's a range of emotions, right? So some people might say that we have 7 emotions. Some people might say we have 5. If you've ever watched the movie Inside Out, which is absolutely spectacular, you get 5 emotions in that one. Which, side note, by the way, if you haven't watched that movie, please do, because it is absolutely the best metaphor for what I'm about to explain goes on in the human brain. They take a child in an adolescent form or pre-adolescent, and she goes through all this stuff, and they talk about memories and so forth. And I think it's beautiful and it's brilliant. The only place it falls short is it does 5 and not our 10. Now, I give credence to that because 10 would be overwhelming, especially for a children's movie. Besides, you just don't want to get into things like contempt in a children's movie. It doesn't make any sense and it's hard to digest. So they did a great job with it. But what Izard's research suggests is that we have 10 what are called core or discrete emotions, and that's D-I-S-C-R-E-T-E, discrete, meaning unique from one to the next, not C-E-E-T, C-R-E-E-T, which is like discreet, keep it quiet and sneaky. So these discrete emotions are such because what his research discovered was that they perform a unique function one to the next. Now, what is this function? Well, it's called an adaptive function, meaning it tells our brains how to adapt to whatever the environment is telling us. So each one of these serves a purpose. Most of them are motivators to go do something, make a change in some area or another, but I'm going to rip through them real fast, and then in the subsequent videos, you'll get an idea about how they apply to our lives. So anger usually motivates to make change. So if I'm angry every time I come into work, I should probably look for a new job. That's not a pleasant place to be in life, angry all the time. However, it also serves to cover up a lot of other emotions, and I'll get into that in a minute. Sadness simply tells us that our expectations were not met. So if you're disappointed all the time, you're walking around depressed all the time, chances are pretty good that you're not aligning expectations with reality, meaning you're expecting something, it's just not being delivered, therefore you're just disappointed all the time. More on that in a moment too. Fear tells us that there's a threat or a danger present. Surprise, well, that helps us reboot our system. So if we're lulling into whatever we're doing, surprise tells us, hey, look out, something's coming, right? Meaning it tells us that there was something that happened that we didn't anticipate. It also serves, like I said, as a reboot mechanism to receive whatever new information is coming. Happiness, well, that tells us that we're getting what we want, stay where we are, keep doing what we're doing, don't change anything. Shame and guilt, very closely related, but not the same. Shame tells us that we failed to meet somebody else's expectations, meaning we caused sadness in another person. And then guilt says, go make it right, make a repair, right? Excitement. Excitement's a really curious one, and I say curious specifically because on the low end of excitement is curiosity or interest. And by the way, all of these are on a continuum from very low to very large feeling. So you can have a little bit of excitement called interest, and hopefully that's what's compelling you to continue watching this video. You want to learn more, and that's what excitement does. It pursues, it helps us discover new things, and it motivates us to keep exploring. A little bit of excitement is interest or curiosity, and what Izard's research told us is that's what actually keeps us awake. So I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about how we don't ever really get all the way out of emotion. Disgust and contempt. Disgust helps to keep us alive because it tells us that something is unhealthy. Interestingly, we can have ideological disgust too. So if you hear about somebody's idea or belief that is harmful, such as racism or totalitarianism, something that takes away somebody's ability to be free, that's pretty disgusting because it's highly unhealthy to be, captive to another person or to be judged based on one's own appearance. So disgust helps keep us alive, but it also has physiological life-saving abilities. So like if you're around something that's unhealthy for you physiologically, like rotting meat or dog poop or something, you get that, that's a disgust emotion. And then contempt is when we look down on people as though they're not like us. So contempt is useful, I'm going to put that in air quotes, I guess, insofar as it's good for defensiveness. So if somebody comes at you and attacks you, you can attack back to save yourself, right? Universally, it's regarded that it's really hard to harm somebody or perpetrate harm upon a person unless you think they're not like you. So that's where contempt comes in. Contempt is useful for war, for conquering, and then again, like I said, for defensiveness. I don't know that it's particularly valuable in a society that wants peace and harmony, but we still have it nonetheless, and that's one of our 10 emotions. So there's a really important difference between emotion and thought. And I think it's illustrative to describe this in a way that can be understood because your brain, my brain, everybody's brain operates virtually the same way. So with apologies that I'm not an artist, I'm a therapist, I'm going to draw what I think is a brain. So this is the brain stem down here, and right above the brain stem, sort of in the middle and rear part of the brain, we have something called the limbic system. The limbic system does a little curlicue up here, and it's got a bunch of glands coming off of it. There's like the thalamus and the hypothalamus and the hippocampus and so forth. And all of those glands do something different. They excrete fluid into the brain to tell us what's going on around us. Now this little guy down here, there's one on either side, and that's called the amygdala. The amygdala, or plural, amygdalae, is responsible for our fight or flight reflex. So that's the first thing that fires whenever something happens in the environment. Typically, it's associated with the emotion of surprise or startling. That, like I said, serves as a reboot mechanism. It clears out the system, and then whatever happens after that unfolds in a pattern that tells the brain that something's going on. Now, the interesting thing here is that while all this is happening, your thinking is not active, or not as active as it should be. So I'm going to draw two tanks here, and we'll pretend that they've got fluid in them. One is very high, and the other is very low. So this is all fluid in here. We'll label this one thinking, T, and this one is feeling. So right now, if you're listening to this video and you're watching it and you're absorbing all this information, and I'm talking to you, and you maybe have some level of interest or curiosity in absorbing this information, your thinking is very high, right? Meaning your emotions are very low. Now, if something were to happen to you in the middle of this, maybe a dog barks, or your kid bursts into the room, or a fire alarm goes off, or the internet quits and the video stops, what would happen is you'd drop out of this thinking mode. This would go very low, and feeling would go very high, meaning your limbic system would turn on, and your prefrontal cortex, your reason, logic, analysis center of your brain would diminish. Now, it doesn't turn off altogether because that would render us basically useless. We wouldn't be able to analyze anything, but it does diminish. So in that emotional state, when your emotions are very high and your limbic system has been triggered and you're flooded with all these brain chemicals, you don't think a whole lot. So an example that I use when I'm teaching this in person is I'll throw a marker at somebody without telling them. And I'll illustrate that when they flinch, some people catch it out of the air, some people just turn, some let it just bounce off their chest, but everybody reacts, right? What they don't do is they don't think about the marker coming at them. They don't think, is it a friendly marker? Is it coming in for a visit? Is it full of ink? Is it even useful, right? What they do is they go, uh-oh, something's coming at my face, and they blink. That's right in the moment where the amygdala fires, the limbic system takes over, and the prefrontal cortex shuts down. So these tanks invert. Now, the marker drops to the floor, or if you're at home, the dog starts barking, you look out the window and you realize it's the UPS person, or the child is ushered out of the room. Whatever the event is, passes. And after the event passes, you return to a thinking mode. So this tank goes back up, feeling goes back down, and you go back to reason and logic. Now, this whole process takes only about, less than 10 seconds. About 3 to 9 seconds is all it takes, because after that, the moment is over. Whatever the event is that triggered your emotional response has passed. So I ask you, why then do people stay in an emotional state longer than a few seconds? Well, simply put, it's because usually they're thinking about the thing that already happened, or they're anticipating something that has yet to come. And the interesting thing about this is we can actually modify our own brain chemistry by where we direct our thoughts. So check this out. When I teach this stuff, I teach it in the form of a wave. Every emotional event has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I've stolen this partially from Carroll Izard, whose name I did not write up here, I-Z-A-R-D, and partially from Dr. Christian Conte, C-O-N-T-E, if you want to look him up. He's got a fabulous YouTube channel. Everything is temporary, beginning, middle, end. Now here's the interesting thing, is right in the middle is where we lose control. You don't think about the marker. You don't stop to analyze it. You don't consider the fire alarm going off until after your brain has registered the event, okay? So then we can return to logic and reason and analyze it and to decide what next steps to take. So why do we stay in emotion longer than a few seconds? Chances are pretty good that it's because we've decided to direct our thoughts on something that's already happened or has yet to happen. Now, loosely termed, that's where we get depression and anxiety, okay? So think generically about what depression is. It's sadness, it's funkiness, it's you're down in the dumps, right? It's usually because you're fixating your thoughts on something in the past that you can't do anything about because it's already dead and gone. Anxiety, therefore, is the opposite. It's when you fixate your thoughts on something in the future that you can't do anything about because it's not here yet. And chiefly, anxiety is rooted in fear, a worry of something. And usually that fear is driven by a lack of ability to control it. So in order to alleviate those, we want to stay right in the present moment. Here's the key though. Being in the present moment means we have to tolerate going through this wave, and right here is where we lose control. Now the good thing is, when we lose control and we push through the other side, life goes on. And the more often we practice this with our brains, the more often we tell ourselves, I can do this. I can get through it. I had an emotional experience and the world didn't spin off its axis. But if you've practiced bailing out, you climb up that wave and you go, nope, I don't want to go there. Nope, I can't deal with it. Nope, that's too scary, deep, intimidating, shameful, whatever it is on this list that you want to avoid, the more likely you are to stuff down emotions, avoid, evade, bail out, suppress, repress, and that's not healthy. Now, what do I say about controlling emotions, controlling thoughts? It's because you don't necessarily have control over whether or not you feel something if the environment throws it at you. You do, however, have control over how much and how long you feel it by your thinking. So if you can recognize emotion, tolerate it, ride through the wave, return to thinking, and you go, all right, I've dealt with this. Now I need to make some plans on how to address it moving forward, how to handle the situation, et cetera, et cetera. If there's nothing going on and you allow your mind to drift, you can find yourself actually shooting brain chemicals into your head that have nothing to do with what the environment is telling you. So picture this. You're sitting by yourself, not doing much, and your mind starts to wander toward the news. And the news is full of fear-provoking headlines and worrisome stories about whatever's going on, right? Well, that's not actually happening right there in your living room or your kitchen or whatever. It's happening somewhere else in the world. It's happening on Twitter. It's wherever it is, right? But it's not right there where you are. But guess what? You're going to feel a fear effect from that. You're going to feel anxiety if you let your mind drift toward whatever it is that scares you and keeps you up at night. Similarly, if you let your mind drift to something that is sad, something you disappointed you, or you disappoint somebody else, and you're living in a dead moment of the past, you can have sad chemicals flowing through your brain too. Now, sometimes I like to hold up a little picture of something cute, like I have a picture of a little fox who's chewing on some grass in my office. It's really adorable. And I'll direct people's attention to that and they'll say, oh yeah, that's cute. I say, see what you did there? You allowed me to direct your attention to that cute little fox who's chewing on the grass. And now you have happy chemicals flowing through your head. That's how easy it is. Now, I'm not saying that it's easy to do this all the time, but with practice, we can get better at it. That'll pull us out of our depression or anxiety or whatever we're feeling that we don't want to feel. Being in the present moment is key. Now, there's something else here. So as we go through life and we experience these waves of emotion, what happens is, like I said, we end up building a practice, okay? So that practice teaches us something. Take, for example, I have young children. I have a 5 and a 3-year-old. The 5-year-old, when he was younger, he had a pacifier. And we know that if you leave a pacifier in a kid's mouth for too long, it kind of forms their palate inappropriately and causes speech problems potentially and all sorts of things, damage to the teeth, whatever. So at some point or another, we had to take the pacifier away, and he wasn't allowed to sleep with it anymore. Well, he was unhappy. So I'm going to work on a sadness curve right now. He went, wah, 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 much longer than a few seconds, right? Why? Well, because he was mentally fixated on the thing that we took away. He wasn't allowing himself to tolerate the distress or to move on. If we had just given it back to him because he's throwing a fit, we would have taught him that losing control is not tolerable, or it's inappropriate if we shout at him or yell at him or something, and we would have effectively bailed him out. Now we can also do this, it's called emotional invalidation. We can also do this by spoiling people. So if I just go, here, eat some gummy worms or whatever, just to shut him up and make him stop crying, it's because I'm not allowing him to tolerate his own distress. And typically it's because I, as the observer of that, have a tough time watching him in distress. It's my issue, not being able to tolerate him losing control or being sad. So if I can't tolerate him cresting this wave, that's a me issue. I need to learn how to do that so that I can shepherd him through it, because here's what happens. I don't give the pacifier back. He cries. Eventually he goes, all right, I had this emotional experience. The world didn't end. Life's moving on. I can go play with my toys or whatever. What that teaches him is the next time an emotional experience happens, so this time it was a pacifier. Next time it may be put your toys away and come to dinner. The wave gets a little bigger. Next time it's come inside, it's getting dark out. Then it's come home from your friend's house, it's time to go to bed. Then it's got a bad grade on a test. Then it's girl he likes doesn't like him back. Then it's girl he's dating dumps him. Then it's dog dies, doesn't get into a college of his choosing, grandma dies. So life gets bigger in its emotional importance and impact. But check this out. Same 3 to 9 seconds on every single one of those events. Girlfriend can only dump you once. Dog can only die once. You can only get rejected from that college once. However long you spend in that moment determines how long your emotional experience is going to last. I'm not saying that you should just get over grandma dying. That's not what I'm saying at all. We need to get through it, and how we get through it is entirely dependent upon our thinking, our reason, our logic. If we allow the event to control us by having us in this emotional state for a really long time, well, that's a lot of power to hand over to something or someone. But if I don't teach him that this is possible, he'll never get to this. And he'll end up discovering over the course of his life that nothing is tolerable. And he'll try to evade or avoid or stuff down or otherwise run away from all emotional experiences. And then what we end up having is something called an affective flattening. So when we don't wear our emotions accurately on our face, we just go, yeah, no, my grandma died, didn't really bother me, whatever. Or worse, we actually fake the opposite emotional state. We're like, yeah, whatever, life goes on. You know how those grandmas just die. That's incongruent with what we're trying to convey. It's something else Izard's research told us, is that somewhere between 88 and 94% of the time, human beings can identify with that level of accuracy what we're feeling by what's on our face, according to these 10. So if you want to improve your communication, you need to learn to be emotionally authentic and transparent. The problem with that is we're often not taught that this peak can be tolerated. So we avoid it. Well, why do we avoid it? Great question. I'm glad you asked that. Here's what I've concluded. Most people, when they avoid emotion, do so because they themselves don't want to lose control. Why don't we want to lose control? Well, it invites risk. Risk of what? Pain. Being vulnerable allows in the opportunity for somebody or something to hurt us. And who wants more pain? Nobody. So what do? We just pretend it doesn't happen and we bail out. But if you really want to improve your relationships and your communication, you have to learn to be vulnerable, because that's what begets intimacy. And real authentic intimacy and connectivity is critical to human development. There's an anthropological theory that suggests the reason that Homo sapiens evolved and not some of the other hominins is because we had a smaller prefrontal cortex, smaller frontal lobe in our skulls, and a bigger emotional center. And if we're connecting through emotions in our tribes, and that's what holds us together, and that's how we tolerate things like climate change and predator attacks, we need the tribe. We need to be able to connect, because if we don't have the tribe, we die. So there's an evolutionary advantage to having emotions that we communicate well to one another. It connects us, it binds us, and it moves us greatly toward community. If you're separated and you're isolated and you're emotionally withdrawn, that can be really problematic, because not only do people not know how to communicate with you, they don't know how to validate you, you don't know how to validate them, and then your relationships start to fall apart. So this stuff's really, really critical. I'm going to go back to the tanks for just a second before I wrap up here. And if you picture in your mind these two tanks of emotion and thought, right? So we've got thinking on one side, feeling on the other. Now let's say these are inverted. Let's say somebody's in a full-blown emotional state. Very, very high emotion, very little cognition. And their tanks look like this. And you're trying to talk reason to them. It's not going to work, because you're talking to this part of the brain, but this part of the brain is overriding it. So in order to get reason across, if you want to convince somebody of a point, or you want to de-escalate them if they're emotionally blown out, this is really key for like first responders and even people in my profession who deal with people who are in emotional crises like frequently. We have to validate. And the reason we have to validate is because we have to drain the limbic system, pull this feeling down so that thinking can come up. Otherwise, we're just wasting our breath. If you think about any time you've had a knockdown, drag-out argument with a loved one or a friend or something, reason and logic typically don't penetrate, because you're literally talking to the wrong part of the brain at that moment. They're not going to hear you. They can't. Physiologically, they can't hear you. So what do? You go, man, yeah, I understand you're angry. You're super angry. You're super angry. Sometimes anger is covering over one of these more vulnerable emotions because it gives us a sense of feeling something, but it's not the authentic thing. Now is not the time in the middle of that argument to try to guess. Be like, you're not angry, you're scared. That will arouse their defensiveness. It'll give them more limbic power and less cognition. You're not going to get through that way. You have to validate. Now, Dr. Christian Conti talks about his 3 components of yield theory: listen, validate, explore options. And you got to go in that order, because if you don't, you try to start exploring options right away, brain's not going to receive the information. This is why, by the way, we have a lot of I love you, man, and brawls in bars where alcohol is present. Alcohol diminishes the frontal lobe and the thinking part of the brain so that emotions can come forward. And so you end up with all this emotionality blown out all over the place and not a lot of logic. Nobody says, you know what I think is a good idea? I'm going to go profess my love to that girl over there I've had a crush on. Nobody says, you know, it's a good idea. It makes a lot of sense. I'm going to go knock that guy off his stool because he's looking at me weird. No, that all comes from emotion. And if our emotions are running high and we don't use our logic, that's often when we do things we regret. So there's more to say. I'm going to do videos on each of these, and we'll explore them in depth. 3 to 5 minutes at a time is my idea. And hopefully you'll get some more insight and information as to how your brain ticks so that you can get a better life, you can have more control over your decisions, and you can have more intentionality about your behaviors and why you do things that you do. So on behalf of the Zephyr Wellness family, I thank you for watching. Please share this, click subscribe if you wouldn't mind, and I wish you great mental wellness.